You ready, folks? So welcome to With Democrats, Things Get Better. This is Simon Rosenberg. This is as I call it, the most important but least understood story in American politics today. And if you can tell me, Judeline, if these are progressing now, our story begins. We're going to go about a half an hour, and we're going to go about a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answer at the end. And again, I apologize for these initial technical problems. Our story begins in 1989 with the end of the Cold War. A new era of globalization began, and everything changed. The world changed, America changed. There was sort of a before and after moment. And what we know from the time since 1989 to today, that we have seen enormous change. Change has been the constant. The world has moved into a single global economy, right? The internet was invented, climate change has become an issue, Putin's insurgency against the West, all these things have happened. It's a time of enormous transformation and change. And it's my belief that one of the ways that we have to think about American politics today that's instructive, the lens that we use, is how have the two parties managed against all that change since 1989? How have they responded to all this change? If change is the constant, right? There's no going back to a previous time. It's about managing change. How have the two parties done? And what you're going to see here, as I'm going to show you, is that there's one party that's managed against change well and another that hasn't. Let's start with the basic measure of how you look at a success of an administration. Jobs created, this is since 1989. Democrats have repeatedly created a lot of jobs, and Republicans haven't. Trump was the first president since Herbert Hoover to have had net job loss on his watch. When you break it down to the 16 years of the two Bushes and Trump and the 16 years of Clinton and Obama, we created 17 times more jobs in those analogous years before Biden came, because I was doing this presentation before the Biden presidency. And then Biden has had now 6 times the amount of jobs created in just his first 2 years as was created over 16 years of Republican presidents. You break it down by jobs per month, which is fair given that Biden's only been in there a short time. And one of the most amazing stats in this whole deck is that Republicans averaged over those 16 years only 10,000 jobs created a month. Last month, over 500,000 jobs were created. So last month, there were the equivalent of 4 years, an entire administration of Republican jobs, right, in 1 month by comparison, right? It's really kind of remarkable. The unemployment rate has gone way down under Democrats and up under Republicans during this period. And again, you're seeing a pattern, right? This is not COVID. What about COVID? What about this? What about that? It's happened consistently. Republicans have brought recessions and spiraling deficits and decline for America. Democrats have brought growth, lower deficits, and progress for the country. And when you add all this up and you look back over these 34 years, there have been 48 million jobs created in America. 46 million of them have been created under Democratic presidents, basically all of them, 96%. And you could stop the presentation here probably. And and I think this tells the story. We know that GDP growth is similar. We've seen very rapid growth more rapid growth under the Democrats. Biden is averaging more 3 times what Trump did. And then we know the market has gone way up during this period since 1989. This is the S&P, but if you look at the Dow was at 2,000 in 1989. It's at 32,000. There's been a 16-fold increase of the Dow during this period. Really dramatic wealth creation in the United States, probably the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of the country. And when you look at it and break it down, it's, obviously most of this wealth that's been created has been created under Democratic presidents. I mean, part of what happened is we went from 1.5 billion, 2 billion customers to 7 billion as the global economy became one single global economy after the end of the Cold War. And our companies were very well positioned. Our companies and our workers built things that people wanted to buy, and America's equities got bid way up, and we've created enormous amounts of wealth in the United States. The truth is that if you had equities and if you owned your home, your wealth has gone way up. If you're just a worker, right, things have gotten better for you, but not nearly 16-fold, right? Things have gone up. You can see during this period, from 1989 on, you've seen progress for all workers of all kinds, but not at 16-fold, right? People are doing better today than they were, but not good enough. And I think as you look at this data, you're going to see that under Democratic presidents, right, median income's gone up. It did go up under Trump, came down a little bit in COVID. But it's really important to look at this because you often hear this very facile line that, over the last 30 years, 20 years, 40 years, that workers' incomes have flatlined, they haven't increased. I mean, it's just not true. They haven't increased enough, right? We have a lot of work to do here, particularly compared to people with equity and wealth. But this is not a flat line. I mean, and when we talk about this being a flat line, we're selling short the huge achievements of the Democratic Party. And we have to be smarter and reject this kind of facile thing that either people have fallen behind or there's been American carnage or whatever the lines are that I think are inaccurately describing what's happened to working people during this period, which is things have gotten better. They just haven't gotten as good as people who own stocks and had real estate. And on the deficit, which is something we are talking about it right now in very vigorous ways. You've seen Republicans have increased the deficit 3 consecutive presidencies. We've reduced it very dramatically in 3 consecutive presidencies. This is just data and fact, right? Trump was one of the most fiscally profligate presidents in American history and probably had one of the worst fiscal records in the history of the country. This is the percentage of the deficit of GDP on an annualized basis. And you can see it all hovered here for a long time in small numbers. And here's Trump, right? Blowing it out. Biggest deficit since World War II. And, you saw the same happened under, this is, by the way, you see how we got to surplus here? This is Clinton. I mean, Clinton got us to surplus here at the end of the 1990s and 2000. Bush comes in, cuts taxes, the deficit goes way up immediately, right? And so, we have been the party of fiscal responsibility, not the Republicans. And again, simple talking point, the deficit went up every year of Trump's presidency. It's gone down every year of the Biden presidency. And on the debt ceiling, something we're having a conversation about, the debt ceiling's been raised much more under Republican presidents than under Democratic presidents. I mean, this idea that the Republicans have some aversion to raising the debt ceiling, it's ridiculous. And it really is one of the most, it's part of, I think, how farcical the current economic conversation really is. I mean, you hear Republicans saying every day that we shouldn't be spending money on Ukraine, we should be spending it here at home. Democrats say, hey, we just passed, the biggest domestic investment program since the 1960s. We agree with you, right? I mean, in the sense that we think we should be spending money here at home and we can fund Ukraine. And of course, the Republican response is, no, we have to cut them all, right? So, at the very core of the current narrative, the Republican story they're telling is at its face absurd. It's almost comical the way that they're engaging in this economic conversation, as if they're not the ones who created spiraling deficits, as if they have any leg to stand on in the attacking Democrats for economic performance. We need to take back this economic debate in this country, and let's just spend a minute just going through a little bit about what Biden has done. This is a new section that just drills down on the Biden presidency a little bit. So first of all, and something super important, we've had the best recovery from COVID of any of the major advanced economies in the world. This is indisputable, right? We also have the lowest unemployment rate today that we've had in peacetime America since World War II. The only 2 times we've been this low have been during the Korean War and during the Vietnam War, during wartime. This is the lowest peacetime unemployment rate, the lowest peacetime unemployment rate since the lowest unemployment rate since 1968, right down in here, this area. Incredible performance by Joe Biden and the Democrats. We have had the lowest uninsured rate in American history. We've had the lowest, just in recent months, we've had the lowest poverty rate in American history. So lowest peacetime unemployment, lowest poverty rate ever, lowest uninsured rate ever, right? We've seen something that's really encouraging to me, that new businesses really grew during COVID, right? People stayed home, they created new things, but that sort of entrepreneurship is continued after COVID ended. We're seeing an explosion of new businesses being formed, sign of incredible health and vitality of the American economy. Wages are also at a very historically elevated rate. And I think this is really important because I think a lot of the arguments that the Republicans made about inflation was exaggerated. And one of the reasons the election didn't go the way they wanted was their core indictment of the Democrats was exaggerated. It wasn't really true because, yes, inflation was high, but so were wages. And so people were paying more, but they were also making a lot more money. And so the impact of inflation was being exaggerated economically, maybe not psychologically, but economically, the data didn't really back up this notion that people were getting crushed. And in fact, in 2022, real earnings were positive for workers. So the average worker actually came out ahead, even with inflation in 2022. Where there was real pain with the inflation that we had in 2022 is if you lived in a rural area and you drove a lot with an inefficient car. I mean, gas really went way up. And there was pain for those people. But that, if you live in an urban area and taking mass transportation, you were experiencing inflation in a fundamentally different way than people who are living in rural areas. How do people in rural areas vote? They vote Republican. Republicans did experience inflation in a much Democrats did. We know that economically and attitudinally, right? We also know that because of the programs we put into place, and also because of people low unemployment rate, people are working, right? We've had ACA subsidies, we've had child tax credit, at least for at least a short period of time. The average worker at the bottom 50% has more money in their pocket and more money saved than they've had in a very long time, right? This is another reason why the Republican attacks, I think, were exaggerated because they weren't truly reflective of what was happening at the bottom end of the workforce, where you've seen the biggest wage gains, by the way, over the last 2 years. We know that there are 2 jobs now open for every unemployed person. It's the most in the modern recorded history, right? This is why we have a worker shortage in the United States, is that there are all these job openings. We don't have enough workers to fill them. Trade deficit has come way down. I know the Republicans care about this a lot. And on a few other issues that are in the national discourse, the crime rate is much lower than it was a generation ago. This is a huge societal accomplishment. It's far safer to be in the United States than it was a generation ago. And yes, it blipped up a little bit during COVID, but not in a way that was super material, right? And we also know that the murder rate, I know Republicans care a lot about this, right? The murder rate in red states is much higher than it is in blue states. And so the entire crime narrative the Republicans are peddling is just red wavy horseshit. And it's something that we have to do a better job at pushing back on. On another big argument they make, that Biden has declared war on oil and gas. This year we're going to have more oil produced in America than any year in American history. And also profit margins and earnings for oil and gas companies were higher last year than they've ever been. So if Biden's waging a war on oil and gas, he's not doing a very good job because they're actually producing more than ever and making more money than ever. And so this whole other narrative about the war on oil and gas is also on its face just absurd and ridiculous. On one of the other big arguments that Republicans make is that Democrats are for open borders, right? We hear this all the time. During the Obama-Biden administration, the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States actually went way down. We're dealing now with a very different set of circumstances that are COVID, environmentally related. The issue on the border now is fundamentally different than it's been in the past. Happy to get into that in Q&A. But this notion that we have some long history of being for open borders is also on its face absurd and ridiculous and needs to be rejected at every step of the way. So America, how are we doing, right? Look at this, lowest peacetime unemployment rate since World War II. Stock market's up 16x, right? Lowest poverty uninsured rate ever. We had the best economic recovery in G7, right? Biden's made these historic investments with chips and infrastructure and the climate bill that are going to create jobs and prosperity for decades to come. And you look at all this and it's like, hey, things are going pretty well. Pretty good president, right? The country is better off today than we've been. And I think this is something that is really at the core of this presentation, which is that we have to reject the poisonous pessimism and the negative sentiment that Republicans are putting into our discourse. I mean, this is a pretty remarkable country. We've come out of this COVID thing pretty well. Joe Biden's been a good president. We're headed in the right direction. We should feel better about ourselves than we do. And it's also important to recognize that all this progress that I just went through has happened during a period when this has happened too. We've had historic flows of immigration into the United States. And so rather than what Trump says, which is that all these immigrants in the country have set us back, in fact, it looks like we've prospered and done well as perhaps any time in our history while we've had this period of mass migration. Immigrants have made us better and stronger and contributed to all this dynamism that we're seeing today. It's a fundamental rejection of the core orientation and narrative of the modern Republican Party. And people, I think it's really interesting. You can cut this data in a lot of different ways, but people became more pro-immigration during the Trump presidency. And I think that it's because I think they had to think about it more. It was put in their face more, and they ended up coming down in the right place. There's at least 3 different polls that have similar data to this. This was, to me, the kind of easiest to read, right? But you can see that from 2016 to 2022, there was a drop in the people who think that we should decrease the amount of immigration, right? I mean, and so there was, the American people came down in the right place on this issue. And certainly on the issue of trade, which is the other part of globalization that we've seen, Democrats remain very pro-trade. We are an open party. We want to be open to the world, right? We are pro-immigration, we're pro-trade, we're pro-connectedness to the world. Our party has many younger people who've grown up in a period where they play video games with people from Romania and China all the time. I mean, they're connected to people. They have an expectation of this connectedness. Our party has a lot of immigrants and people near the immigrant experience who also expect this kind of connectedness. It is incredibly assuring to see that you haven't seen the kind of reactionary sentiment in the right translate over to our side. So by so many measures today, right, life is better than it's been, and perhaps better than it's ever been. I mean, it is possible that, being alive here in America today, that we have more economic opportunities than we've ever had, certainly for women and people of color. I mean, you go back and look at the 1950s and 1960s, some people were using data from that period. Well, that was before, that was when we were living in a segregated country and, women were not in the workforce. I mean, we've achieved all of this while we've seen this explosion of opportunity for women and people of color. And so the success that we've had as a party has not just been in governing, it's also been in politics. And let me go through this, right? Since when I joined the Clinton campaign in January of 1992, we had lost 5 out of the 6 previous presidential elections, 2 of them by very large margins. Even in 1976, when we won after Watergate, which at that point was the biggest scandal in American history, we'd only won by 50.1. We had not been performing well since 1968 in presidential elections. It was a period, a 24-year period of where we really struggled as a national party to win elections, even against people that were considered to be extremists at that time, right? And so since then, and Bill Clinton set out to make the Democratic Party competitive at the presidential election again, the presidential election level again, we've won more votes in 7 out of 8 elections. No American political party has done that before in American history. This is the best popular vote run of a political party in American history. I'm really proud of this. This has been core to my life's work, right? And you can see the Republicans have only broken 48% once during this entire period. They got up to 50.7 in 2004. It's really kind of remarkable that when you look at this, that the Republicans could possibly control 2/3 of the Supreme Court, given that the country is clearly more Democratic than it is Republican. I mean, you often hear Republican commentators say it's a center-right country. I mean, bullshit, right? I mean, no way is this a center-right country. I mean, look at this. It's one of the most ridiculous things that you hear on national television, right? And also, I just want to put an exclamation point on what happened in 2022, which was, I think this is going to go down as one of the most remarkable election performances by a political party in our history. Despite, high inflation and low Biden approval, Democrats gained ground, right, in these 7 critical battleground states: Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. Incredible achievement, really important for 2024. We've now had 3 very good elections in a row in the key battlegrounds that determined the presidency. We picked up a Senate seat. We won state house seats. We didn't lose any state house chambers, right? We picked up governorships. We kept the House close. I mean, the House was essentially margin of error. I mean, couple votes here and there, we could have been in the majority. We did better in the early vote than we did even in 2018 and 2020. Incredible, given that we were told a red wave was coming. And in fact, what we saw was all this Democratic intensity, right? Our candidates dramatically outraised Republicans, which is a big structural advantage we have. Our grassroots has become muscular and stronger. Many of you maybe have been part of groups that worked really hard in this election. And also, one thing that I don't think is well understood is the Southwest has really become a place of incredible power for Democrats. In 2004, Bush won Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada. Republicans controlled 5 out of the 8 Senate seats in that region. In 2020, Biden won those 4 states, first Democrat to do so in 80 years. And we now, if you count Sinema with us, who knows, we have there are no Republicans now, senators in these 4 states. It's incredible. We've done so well in the Southwestern region. And so when you look at party identification over this period since 1989, there have been more people are more Democratic than Republican. We've done well during this period. We haven't done everything, not everything has gone our way. We had these 2 freaky elections in 2000 and 2016, obviously, where we won the popular vote and didn't win the presidency. And so the country is not where we want it to be. But politically, I think we have done better than people understand. And so if I'm right, by the way, that the people of the United States, since, if you came of age politically after Reagan and you experienced these 3 good Democratic presidents and these 3 not so good Republican presidents, then people in their mid to late 40s and younger should be much more Democratic than Republican, right? Just based on lived experience. And that's what we find. This is the under 45 vote. The under 45 vote was a swing vote. It was a jump ball in the Clinton and Bush years. And now you can see after 2006, it's become structurally a very big Democratic vote. We get very big margins with younger people. In this last election, the exit polls had it at 13%. Pew had it at 20. I'm probably going to settle at 13 for the sake of this analysis. And even Biden in 2020, right, outperformed Obama with under 45-year-old voters, showing that this is a structural advantage that we have. This is really important to understand. For us. And among 18 to 29-year-olds, right, it's a similar, it's more acute. And Biden still did very well, with 18 to 29-year-olds. But we're doing very well with young people. We lose over 45, and our margins of victory come from the margins with under 45-year-old voters. And those voters of these generations, the millennials and Gen Z, are becoming an ever increasingly big part of the electorate, right? This is why this matters. This is good for us, not so good for them, right? And so despite all this, though, that I've just gone through, we are still underperforming on the economy. And this is, I think, our big collective political project in 2023 and 2024. I want to show you this data. It's kind of startling. I showed you all that data, right? All the jobs have been created, growth, spiraling deficits, recessions, Republicans, right? But in 2020, this is on AAP Vocast, Biden won the COVID voters 3-1. 41% said they were COVID voters. We won those voters 3-1. But the voters who cared more about the economy, we lost those voters 4-1. And on this basic question is that who's better able to handle the economy, Trump crushed Biden, right? So Biden goes into the White House with kind of a structural issue on the economy. He didn't make a deep economic connection to voters during the election on the economy. He did on COVID, and that's why he became president. It was a more important issue. But it means that he went in with a structural deficit. And you can see it show up in the data, right? This is June of 2021. Biden's up 27 on COVID, 20 on healthcare. He's only up 4 on the economy, right? So this is demonstrating that, there was he had structural issues, right, on the economy here that he needed to deal with. And this is now from earlier this year. You can see it again, job approval in Navigator. He's down 6 in job approval, down 13 on the economy, right? So this, the issue of the economy, we can't do what we want to do in 2024 unless we close the gap here. And you can see, I want to show you this, right? This is data from January. This is new data just last month. We're up here on abortion, healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, right? Democracy, government running well. But then as soon as you start to get into these economic measures, right, we're in negative territory. here. And we've just got to get into positive territory on the economy. Sorry. Or we can't have the election that we want to have next year. We can't defeat MAGA in the way that we want to defeat them unless we get into positive territory and what is likely to be the number one issue in the election next year. The good news is if you go to Navigator, you can see that when you test these arguments about the Democratic accomplishments, they can move voters. We can get into positive territory. They did a ballot test where we started down -5 on the economy and we ended up +3, right? It's not as much as we need, but it shows that if we make our case more forcefully and we get loud about it, we can make gains here. This is where we got to be. I want to be a little bit higher than this, but I'll take this. If we're up +3 by the end of 2023, I think we should be happy. To me, the most important thing we can do to win the presidential election in 2023 is win the big economic debate that we're going to have with the Republicans. We all need to become information warriors on the economy, learn this data that I'm sharing with you, and fight it out in the public arena. We'll talk more about that in the Q&A. So here's my thoughts. What does all this mean for us going forward, right? So one is the two parties are not the same. We need to reject in every way possible this notion that there's a left and a right and they're kind of equally virtuous and equally at fault for the problems facing the country. It's just not true. There's been a good party that's governed well and another party that's continually not done its part when they've been in power. We have to establish at some point this fundamental asymmetry, this contrast, rather than allowing this kind of facile, simple, well, there's two parties and they're kind of the same, right? We didn't create an insurrection in 2021. I mean, go down your list of things of how we're not the same. We're not the same. And we need to reject any attempt by anybody, including people in our party, to create an equivalency between the left and the right. It's really important. We also, I think, need to recognize that we are in a period that to me feels a lot more like 1945, 46, 47 than it does 1932, 33, 34, meaning that we've come out, the world is coming out of a collective trauma. There's been a lot that's been unsettled. We have more refugees today in the world than we've ever had in world history. We need to recognize Joe Biden needs to not just build back better here, but we need to build back better around the world. We have to, we were called once before, our party in the 1940s, to lead the fight against authoritarianism, to preserve democracy and freedom here and around the world. And I think we're being called again. I think this is an analogous moment to that period where, we are being called to defend democracy and freedom in this global order that our party built in the 1940s. And it's really important, I think, as we go forward to go get back connected to this speech that FDR gave and the argument FDR made in 1941 in his State of the Union address, where he laid out the famous four freedoms. To me, this is the most important political speech ever given in American English, the most consequential one, certainly, because this basic framework, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, so elegant, so simple, right, so powerful, became the framework in which the post-World War II era was built upon, right? This was in the Atlantic Charter. It's in the Charter of the United Nations. It's our theory of the case where we didn't imagine a world of dominion where there were some people in charge of other people. We imagined a world of freedom. This is really important, right? This is the great liberal vision, right, coming out of World War II. And this was the idea of a world that we wanted to build, that our party wanted to build. We chose freedom as opposed to dominion and authority over one another, right? And that world that we imagined and built has created a golden age for humankind. There's never been a time to be alive in all of human history where people have had more opportunity, have lived such good lives as they're living today. Life expectancy has gone through the roof. Global, wealth has skyrocketed all around the world. Poverty has been reduced dramatically in recent years. We are in a golden age, and that's a golden age that our party created, right? We built this. This is a big deal, right? I make the case that, this work that we did is we probably have done more good for more people as a party than any other organized group in the history of the world. Who's built a world like this? It's also why we have to be so vigorous about defending it, because this really was the extension of the American Revolution to the rest of the world. More people live under democracy today than any time in human history, for example. So we're living in a golden age, and that's why we're being called as Democrats, the ones who built this world, to make sure it's preserved for our kids and their grandkids. And I think it's really important as we go forward in these battles to get more connected to the greatness of the Democratic Party and the things that we've done. Not only have we built this world that I described and conquering authoritarianism, but here at home, right, we've done extraordinary things during this period as well. And I think we have to recognize this. I mean, I am proud to be a Democrat. I'm proud of my party. I think we have really purposefully set out to try to do good. And since 1989 and the Berlin Wall fell, our presidents have moved the country forward. And the contrast between how we've continually moved things forward and the Republicans have continually failed to do their part is really, I think, this big project. We have to tell this story. It's critical. The country needs to understand this because it's part of our history. It's true. And any attempt to create an equivalency of the two parties obscures the fundamental reality of our time, which is that Democrats have done a lot of good and Republicans have failed to do their part. But I think the story of the Republican Party now is not just about failure to do their part. It's become something else, right? It's also become about malevolence and illiberalism and authoritarian impulses, as we're seeing down in Florida right now. The Republican Party has mutated from a conservative party into a dangerous party of MAGA. And just like we have an obligation to tell the American people the story that I'm telling today, we have an obligation to be honest about what's happened with Republicans, right? This is not the party of Lincoln and Reagan any longer. This is now a far-right, illiberal, dangerous party that has contempt for democracy, contempt for rule of law, contempt for elections, contempt, for civil society in many ways. They want more people to die with guns and more people to die with COVID. We can go down the long list. They become a dangerous, reckless force. And so part of our job as proud patriots is to try to loosen the grip of MAGA on the Republican Party, not just to defeat Republicans, but to beat the Republicans in a way that MAGA goes into the dustbin of history and feels like a bad, terrible dream that we all had, as opposed to becoming a present reality in the years to come. And I think that as we think about, you often hear people say, well, what's gone wrong with America? American carnage, blah, 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 blah. Remember this, right? I mean, it's been the Democrats who repeatedly made things better in tumultuous and transformative times. Almost all the jobs created in the last 34 years has come under Democratic presidents, right? And so when you hear people talk about what's gone wrong, Washington isn't broken. Our politics isn't broken. One of our two political parties is broken. This is what's actually happened, right? Something has gone wrong with the Republican Party, not America, not our politics, not Washington, right? Not whatever you want to say. It's with them. And we have an obligation to tell the story truthfully and honestly to the American people, to our friends and family, to our peers, to voters, because this is the country they live in and they need to understand what's happening. And if there's any doubt about the threat of what the Republican Party's become, let's spend a moment looking at this, right? We know what we got to do, everybody. Thank you for being here today. And, we need to be loud and proud about what we've done. We are part of one of the most noble and consequential political projects in human history. And we have all, as a party, we've been called before, and we're being called again. Thanks, everybody. Let me open it up for Q&A, and I'm sorry for the technical issues at the beginning. I think we have solved them, Dudley. And let me open it up to questions. There are multiple ways to ask questions, as all of you know. You can raise your hand. You can put stuff into the chat. Carol Moore, I'm curious whether the failure of Congress to extend the expanded child tax credit has led families feeling an economic pinch and soured them in the overall economy. I don't think that's the case, because I think they never felt good about the economy. And certainly it's possible that what you're saying is true, but it would be on the margins. I mean, I think it's an important point, though, that people had something that was taken away. I think I will tell you, though, there was a lot of ambivalence with voters about the child tax credit, and we can talk about it, further. But the bottom line is that my view about why we're not getting more credit for what's happened with the American economy is that we haven't worked hard enough to get credit for it. I think this is on us. And if you look at what Joe Biden did at the State of the Union last week, I mean, he was loud and proud about his administration and what he's done. I think we spent most of 2022 talking about inflation. And what we ended up doing is we ended up making the Republican argue. Every time we talked about inflation, we were making the central Republican attack against us. We were making it for them. And what I had been arguing during that period is we needed to talk about all the good things that were happening, and we could say inflation was too high. Instead, we talked about inflation all the time. And I think it interfered with our ability to tell the rest of the story. And I know there's a big debate in the Democratic Party about this. There are a lot of people that, including people in the White House, that didn't really agree with me on this. And I think they were wrong. I want to be clear about this. And I think that, when you are in debates, and I was on Fox News for 17 years and did thousands of appearances, you've got to make your case first and then respond to the incoming as it comes in. And basic debating tactics, right? Basic comms 101. If people aren't going to know that things are better unless we tell them, and we can't expect them to just come to it on their own. So I do think what I'm saying, Carol, is that I think that based on the data, is that I think we have an opportunity to really make a big difference in people's understanding about the country that they live in. And so Sylvia, thank you for coming, Tono Latino, right? On slide 55, about folks informed about the economy. Can you give us your opinion on what's going on with Hispanic voters? I appreciate you saying this because I've actually shared some of this data. And Sylvia, you and I'm happy to do a session with you to walk you through all this. We have a problem with Hispanic men, I think, and Hispanics on the economy. I mean, I could show you other data and you picked it up, but I mean, we're 15, 20 points lower with many Hispanics on the economy than we are with African Americans, with AAPI voters. There's a clear weakness there. My view about what happened on this, and this is an opinion as opposed to something grounded in clear data and focus groups and so on, is that I think the shutdown Democrat argument was very effective with Hispanic men. Hispanics during COVID, right? Hispanics got COVID more than other people, died of COVID more than other people. They had higher percentage of Hispanics at jobs where they had to go face and still continue to work in threatening environments. And so the argument that we shut down the economy and prevented people from going to work for families that had far less wealth to fall back on, if you're an Hispanic undocumented immigrant, you don't have the social safety net. I mean, Hispanics are living on the edge more than the rest of the economy. And so the shutdown was deeply impactful in Hispanic families. And I think there's this lingering concern that Democrats are no longer on the side of hardworking Hispanic men and their jobs and their families. And I think the good news is we can go win that. I think we can fix that, right? I think that's a fixable thing. I mean, the Hispanic unemployment rate has been lower in the last 6 months than it's ever been. The uninsured Hispanics have gained more from the ACA than any other part of the American population. We have a good story to tell, but we got to tell it. And that's why, if you've noticed, the White House has announced a Latino prosperity tour. I'd like to believe that that's come about in part because of advocacy I've done inside the White House about the need to make this the central discussion with Hispanic and Latino voters about economic opportunity. And so I'm optimistic, Sylvia, that we sort of collectively understand this and that you're starting to see a plan come from the White House to really address this rhetorically. Happy to talk to you more about it offline. Great catch, and you're absolutely right. Cindy, how can one issue pro-democracy organizations tie into the economy without seeing partisan? It's a great question. And I think for pro-democracy organizations, I think that this idea that the Republicans have become a negative sentiment machine and are talking down the country, talking down the accomplishments of the United States, of the West, is fair game in a pro-democracy setting. And I think that because I believe that part of what Great MAGA's strategy is, and when I say Great MAGA, I include Russia, right? And potentially, Iran and China and people who are putting stuff into our discourse, is that I think what they want us to do is they want us to feel bad about democracy, about America, about each other, about our leaders, our institutions. They want to degrade trust and respect for the United States and the virtue of the country. And that's why by talking up America, talking up the fact that we have low unemployment, that American government can work, that we are not, we're not failing as an enterprise, I think that has to become part of the pro-democracy conversation, right? I think that because I think putting positive sentiment into our discourse is part of what we have to do to respond to the negative sentiment machine that MAGA has become. And I think that, you just saw last week, the EU had a big conference on disinformation. Europe is much further ahead than we are in understanding the nature of the conflict that we're really in. Because the conflict that we're in with pro-authoritarian forces is not just political, right? It's cyber, it's disinformation, it's military, it's geopolitical, right? We're in a far more wide-ranging conflict. And in Europe, they call that hybrid war, right? I mean, the country was attacked in 2016. It's as if it never happened, right? The Russians intervened dramatically in our election, and I think were instrumental in electing Trump. I don't think Trump would have been elected, my own view, without the Russian intervention in 2016. It's one of the reasons I think Putin has been so cocky, in essence, right? In that he was able to flip an American president, interfere in our election. If he could do that, then he could take Ukraine, right? And so I think that we have to recognize that we're operating in this, that part of the dimension of our fight for democracy is in information. And part of that is about negative and positive sentiment. I've become very convinced that part of what we need to do to defeat MAGA and defeat authoritarian impulses is to create more positive sentiment in our discourse and to not respond to their pessimism with our own pessimism, right? And I think you saw that with Joe Biden last week in the State of the Union. Janine, Simon, can you tweet or email talking points, graphics to enable us information warriors to share this Democrat? I'm not sure I totally understand, Janine. Let me just say this presentation is going to be up on YouTube and on our website in a few minutes, right, when we're done. A lot of the data that you see in here is on my website. I also tweet this stuff out all the time. I don't release the deck, but I release the presentation. And also, for those of you who are part of grassroots groups, I am making myself available to speak, right, and to talk to grassroots organizations all across the country. I've already spoken to 7 or 8 groups since the new year. I've got a few more that are scheduled. I recognize that there is a new kind of intensity and passion in the grassroots that's sprung up because of Zoom, where people are now part of these organizations that they couldn't be part of before. I want to do my best to continue to make these stronger and more powerful. I think it's made us much stronger as a political party. Andrea, I'm going to get you in 1 second. Let me just take one more written question. Eric, what's the strategy for getting the economic message out? Let me be very clear to all of you. You have to stop thinking about this as somebody else's job, right? Is that, we are all proud patriots. We love our country. We want the best for our children. But don't think that winning this economic debate is the job of Joe Biden or the Democratic Party or people in Washington. It's all of our jobs. We all have the ability to reach 10 people a day. We all have the ability to put more positive sentiment into our discourse. My own tweeting and my public engagement has really changed in the last couple of years. I'm spreading a lot less negative information, trying to stay more in the hopium camp, right, than in the negative information camp. And what I would just encourage you to think about is, when I worked in the war room in 1992, think in your mind's eye, the war room is like 20 young people drinking Red Bull, producing videos, fighting it out, right? The way we have to think of the war room now is 4 million people getting up every day, spreading this good news through their networks. If 4 million people, reach 10 more people a day, that's 40 million people, right? And that's what the right has. What the right has is they're networked and amplified. When stuff goes out of Fox News, it goes out into their networks. They spread it out through their networks, however you reach people through your network, TikTok, Instagram, email, whatever it is, right? You have to be aggressive. You have to be an information warrior. You can't be annoying, right? But you gotta show up. You gotta be in the space. They win debates when we're quiet. We have to go on offense here. We have an incredible story to tell. Help me tell it. Eric, you wanna help me? Email this presentation to everybody you've ever met. Put it on your, your Facebook page, right? Do your part to help input better and more positive information into our poisoned discourse every day. This is all of our jobs. This isn't the job of people in Washington. We all have a role to play here. Many of you have done work on campaigns, right? You've texted, you've phone banked, you've written postcards, you've given money. Now there's this other thing we have to do on top of that, which is we have to be in the information war every day, 24/7, 365. We have to change our mindset. We have more power and agency here than we understand. But it only, and Timothy Snyder, who I recommend that all of you follow, who's a professor at Yale, is probably the leading authority on fascism and authoritarianism and the Cold War, has written a book where he goes through the lessons of fighting against authoritarianism. It's called On Tyranny. I strongly recommend it. His number one lesson is do not obey in advance. And what that means is do not take the authoritarian impulses and things that they want you to do and obey. By standing up, by being loud, by being an information warrior, you're not obeying in advance. You're doing exactly what Timothy Snyder has recommended. And we have to recognize that we have more power here. We can be louder than them. And to me, in the next 2 years, we have a lot of great organizations doing great work. Resolute Square, Courier and Newsroom, Pod Save America, right? Deep State Radio, all these groups, Midas Touch, these guys are doing phenomenal work. But our superpower is all of you. It's the love of country, the patriotism, the fear of MAGA. We need to be louder. In the next 2 years, if we get millions of people getting up every day, doing what I'm doing right now, I'm just a guy, and I'm a private citizen. We can be louder than them, and I think win this economic debate in 2023, and then win the presidency in 2024. Let me go to Andrea, who's had her hand raised here, unless she just disappeared. Okay, there it is. Andrea, come on in. What?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, fire away.
I was just wondering, I'm from Iowa, and 2022 was a great year nationally, but it wasn't a great year in Iowa.
Yeah.
And I think that's a true story in a lot of rural areas. It's just becoming harder and harder. I think in the House in Iowa right now, we only have people who represent the urban and suburban areas. We don't have a single House member that represents a rural district anymore. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the struggle that we're facing in deeper red areas in the US.
Yeah, okay. And I'll do my best in this because there's no magic bullet here, right? I mean, there's no simple solution. The first thing I want to say is about what happened in 2022, right? There was not a single election in 2022. There was a bluer election inside the battleground where we gained ground and did really well. But there was a redder election outside the battleground, right? Where, in the battleground, we had these muscular campaigns. Our candidates raised more money than Republicans. We're able to control the information environment, push the early vote and our GOTV stuff in ways that we never could before because of how much money we have. So a lot of success. Phenomenal election inside the battleground, historic election inside the battleground, an amazing achievement. Outside the battleground, it looked more like a typical midterm election, right? We didn't do well. We lost ground, not only in Iowa, but in New York and California and Florida and Texas. And the admonition to me there is that, when we build these big campaigns, right, we can control the information environment and we are in control of our own destiny. Where we don't, they're still too loud. And they still control the information flow. I mean, anyone who lives in an exurban or rural area knows that there's almost no center left voice in these, in the daily discourse in these places. We've lost local news organizations in many places. And the first thing is that we need to become more intentional about winning the daily national information war. It can't be that people in rural and exurban areas are only hearing Fox News and right-wing talk radio and OAN and all the things that they have, right? And that's part of it, is that we are not competing adequately at the national level. We don't have a Fox, we don't have a national network of people taking our arguments into these communities. And that's why I'm so adamant about this concept of information warriors, that what's happened in other places where we've seen Democrats do well and get better, in Arizona and Georgia in recent years, in many cases, those efforts were led by local people, right? I mean, they were people that, went to a 24/7, organizing model, 24/7, 365 organizing model. They changed their electorate to create more younger people and people of color. I think those are things that we have to start doing year-round registration with under 45-year-old voters as much as we can. This is where, even in Texas, Beto O'Rourke lost that election badly. He won under 45-year-old voters by 10 points in that race. And so I'm willing to bet that even in Iowa, under 45-year-old voters are a majority or plurality Democrat. We need as many of them to vote. I mean, I think that one of the things we have to do nationally, and I'm going to be doing more work in this regard, is that we need to get voter turnout among under 45-year-old voters to be as close to older voters as possible. We just cannot accept the level of turnout with the most Democratic part of the electorate. This is like a very baseline, fundamental rethink that has to happen in our party. We all just assume that young people are going to vote less. Why? Why do we accept that? Why? We have a lot of money now. We live in a culture of abundance, not scarcity as Democrats. We got a ton of money. We got to spend, we got to go to year-round youth-based organizing. You've got to maximize the Latino vote in Iowa, which is increasingly, in many rural agricultural areas, the Latino community is growing very rapidly. That's another area of enormous opportunity for you in Iowa. I also think we're going to have to use, I think, two final things, and I want to wrap it up, is, we got to show up, right? You got to contest, you got to have candidates, you got to be there, you got to give a shit. It can't be an afterthought. If you want to get rural vote, if you want to get anybody's vote, it's got to be important to you. And if it feels like it's an afterthought, then you're not going to do well, right? It's really kind of basic stuff. And then finally, I do think that many of the big investments that Biden is making on infrastructure, the climate bill, the CHIPS bill, those rural communities are going to benefit from this investment. And we have to use this. I think that Biden has a theory that, like FDR, these big investments he's made are going to open doors up to voters that were closed to us because we've impacted their economic lives, right? We'll see. I mean, I'm a little skeptical. I don't know that the struggle we're having in rural communities is economic only. I think it's far more complex than that. It's cultural, it's race. There's a lot of complexity, all this. But I think you have to do all those things, Andrea. I mean, I don't think it's a simple thing. And you can't give up, right? I mean, you have to keep fighting. And I think it's important to learn from other places that have seen substantial improvement in their standing. And what they've done, like in Arizona and Georgia. I mean, I will tell you that the success we've had in Arizona and Georgia in the last two elections, we wouldn't have the majority in the Senate without it, right? But it's also an incredibly important story that every other state in the country can look at and study what they've done, where they were down, and then they were up, and it wasn't, it was a plan. There was a plan there. It's not as easy because they've had a lot of young people move in who are more liberal, right, than the old parts of the electorate, and that's happening in Texas and other parts of the Sun Belt as well. And so there's raw material there, but I think it's all those things, right? And let me just see if I can take one more question, and then I'll close because we did start a little bit late. Let me try to. I just covered some of the rural stuff for you. Let me go to Jay. I mean, there's a lot of questions here. I mean, all these are. Let me just finish this because they all are sort of pointing to the same thing. I mean, there's no silver bullet here, folks, right? This is very hard, this game. I've been doing this full time for 30 years. And what I can tell you is I think something really important has happened to us in the last 6 months, which is that we've regained confidence in ourselves. Joe Biden was a confident president. And I think I have this mantra that I want to end with, which is that Joe Biden is a good president. The country is better off. The Democratic Party is strong. All those things are true. And one of the things we have to get better at as Democrats is speaking in declarative sentences. We can say Joe Biden is a good president. It doesn't have to be but. There's no but. Stop the but. Stop stop making Republican arguments for them. speak in declarative, simple sentences, right? The economy is strong. Joe Biden's a good president. The Democrats have made the country, with Democrats, things get better. Don't immediately go to what Democrats do, which is put it, but there's 100 people in a room, 97 of them have jobs. We talk about the 3 people that don't have jobs, right? And it's not that we don't lack compassion, is that it's also just silly. I mean, we have the lowest unemployment rate in American history, right? I mean, in peacetime America since World War II. We have to be able to say that in declarative, simple sentence, right? Boom, without then saying, but there's more work to do. I mean, that's the whole game here. We've done really well. We've come a long way. Of course, there's more to do. But if all we do is talk about all the things we haven't done, then people aren't going to know about the things that have been done. And that's the difference between politics and advocacy, right? When you're somebody who works in an advocacy organization, your job is to constantly remind the politicians about there's still more things to be done. The politician's job is different. It's to remind voters about all the things that have been done and how much better things are because of us, and that we still have more to do. And if we continue to live in negative space, right, in the place, in all the things, and I think that's part of what happened to us in 21 and 2022. I think part of the reason people didn't know about all the good things that we did is we didn't tell them. We talked about all the things, many people in our family talked about all the things that hadn't gotten done. Their constant, chronic disappointment, right? And part of what I just tried to show you today is that, the American economy is doing better than any economy in the developed world. Lowest unemployment rate, poverty rate, all this stuff. How can you look at that and not say, holy shit, that's amazing. Well done, guys. Good work. What an amazing country we live in. Such an extraordinary place. Are there problems? Yeah, guns. I mean, we can go through the list. But if you don't spend time celebrating the greatness and the goodness of the country, then we're doing MAGA's work for them. And part of what we have to do is we have to get connected to how remarkable this country is. And because it's the most remarkable country in the world, we have things we have to work on. But if we can't live in the light, if we can't celebrate our progress, we are going to hand the keys of our democracy over to them. And because we're also not being truthful to our fellow citizens about the true nature of things, right? The economy may be better today than it's ever been in American history, period. The crime rate is much lower today than it was 30 years ago. We did not oversee open borders. All of these red wavy kind of narratives that Republicans use to describe who we are, almost all of them are completely false and they're lies. And we need to push back to make it harder for the national media to continue to echo, as they do, these fundamentally fallacious attacks on who we are and what we've done. Because what happens is they want us to think worse about America, about our party, our leaders, our institutions. That's their goal. Don't let them win. Don't let them win, right? Being positive and optimistic and believing in your country and your fellow men and women in this country is part of what it means to be a patriot now. Because we have another group of people that want us to, that are talking down America every day. We need to talk it up. Those are my thoughts. Love you guys. It's been a lot of fun fighting in the trenches with you. I show this presentation once a month. The video will be up in a few minutes. Share it with everyone you've ever met. And let's make sure that we are bringing it every day in the next in the next year and a half. We can do this, right? We should have a good election in 2024. We've done a good job. We got to go sell what we've done. Be part of that effort with me, with Joe Biden, the DNC, and everybody else. Thanks, everybody.